everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. Today's episode's another analysis, and I think it's going to be my most developed episode. And I say that because it's taken me several months to develop this analysis, and I've finally gotten to the point where I feel comfortable sharing it. It's an analysis that's kind of helped me piece together several strands of the current moment that feel a bit disparate, that feel somewhat separate, but in reality obviously is very connected to one another. And here I'm talking about police brutality from France to Germany to the United States. Here I'm talking about how so many governments seem to have lost their minds and are doing whatever it takes to defend the Zionist state, you know? There's a lot of stuff that feels very fucked up right now, and I think this analysis kind of puts it in sort of a narrative. I am going to be talking a bit about large swaths of history, which I tend not to like to do, but I do think there's a usefulness, a utility to these narratives. So yeah, strap yourselves in. I'm going to try to do some structure, which will be new for me. And before I start, I have a couple of usual announcements. If you want to support this podcast, there are a few ways you can do so. You can head over to patreon.com/firethesetimes to become a member of our Patreon, where you'll get access to exclusive content and an invitation to our monthly hangout. I mean, one of the exclusive content is my new sub-series, Keep This Between Us, where I tell funny and interesting stories that have happened to me over my life. If you don't want to become a member, you can also give a one-time donation through the tip jar, which I have in the notes below. If you're not able to support this podcast financially, you can still support by rating this podcast or leaving it a review wherever you listen to it. Really helps with the algorithm, and yeah. So, this episode is going to go through a little bit of a structure. I'm going to start a little bit with a disclaimer before I jump into a summary and then my analysis and kind of conclusions. But so, I do have several disclaimers. Obviously, I'm going to talk a lot about A Clockwork Orange, and so there are going to be a lot of spoilers for the book and for the movie, even though they're both actually very similar in terms of content. The story includes intense scenes of violence, including sexual violence, and so massive trigger warning if you're going to watch it or read it. I'm going to try in this analysis to describe it, but obviously not go into the gratuitous details that are in the story. But I just wanted to mention that here because I think even though there are such intense scenes in the film, obviously I see it as a critique of fascism, but I think the themes and the messages are quite powerful. So, all that to say, spoiler alert, trigger warning, although light trigger warning for the podcast. Trigger warning for if you're going to watch it. So I'm going to start with a very brief summary, and I'm going to condense the entire thing to 5-6 sentences. It's an incredible film. It's a cinematic masterpiece, whatever as they say. I mean, I don't want to get all up Kubrick's ass because there's 1,001 filmmakers already up that ass. But it was, I think, the first film that I'd seen that was cinema, you know? But anyway... But yeah, I'm going to condense it and just sum it up for the purposes of this analysis, right? So the story revolves around a character, Alex. It's set in a kind of futuristic dystopia, and this guy is part of a gang, and it's a kind of lawless society. He and his gang go and do acts of violence for pleasure, right? Ultra violence. In one of these assaults, he gets caught, he goes to prison, and he manages to get out of prison early because there's this new form of rehabilitation, quote unquote, which uses basically behaviorism conditioning, right? They sit him down, they force him to watch acts of gore, of violence, of Nazis marching, of death camps, and they inject him with a drug that elicits a kind of feeling of nausea and of illness, so basically what happens afterwards is once he gets out, he is no longer able to do violence. Every time he does, he throws up, right? And so in the logic of the law enforcement, whatever, he is a rehabilitated person who's able to go back into society. In the end of the film, it's ambiguous whether or not he fully recovers, right? From the violence, you know what I mean? It's left ambiguous. In the book, he does kind of get better, you know what I mean? He no longer desires violence. The film ends on an ambiguous note, you know? We're really not sure if this method of removing his desire for violence worked or if it's still there. The one main difference in the book that I will point out is that in the book, one of the main person who like catches Alex in the end is a guy who he had assaulted earlier on. And in the book, it turns out that he is a journalist who is particularly interested when he discovers Alex at his doorstep, right? Sorry if I've said too much little plot lines that I didn't really describe. It's unnecessary. But the point is that he's a journalist who is writing about the exact procedure that Alex was forced to go through. And his article about this, or I think his book, is called A Clockwork Orange, right? This explicit use of the word is not used in the film, and it's very explicit in the book that A Clockwork Orange is like a metaphor, right? Is a very intentional, paradoxical oxymoron. That an orange is something that's grown organically and that has all its parts put together through a process of, organic growth. What the critique the journalist has, who's writing the book A Clockwork Orange, is that it's ridiculous, it's paradoxical, it's futile to try to turn an orange into a machine, into a clockwork orange. The idea that you can just go into an orange and like surgically remove this little bit, in the same way that the procedure tries to surgically remove the desire to act violent, right? He's saying this is ridiculous, it's ludicrous, it's a bad idea. So, why am I here thinking about A Clockwork Orange in 2024, 8 months into this genocide, and watching the world kind of fall apart, or at least the kind of liberal international order, whatever, and especially being placed within Europe watching this? Well, initially, I had been thinking a lot about it, and here again I will say, just to kind of pat myself on the back, that I've tried reading analyses of this film and of this book, and I don't see this. Most analysis is about human nature and our like universal inclination to violence and whatever. There is a solid like obvious critique that people are aware of behaviorism as a form of fascism, as a kind of way of thinking of human behavior and of humans as like a means to an end, and that we can just go in and like fix and change and do our little, you know what I mean? Like the control this doctor had over Alex's body was a control of fascism, was a complete control, full dehumanization of this person, and it's bullshit. Anyway, so why I initially started thinking about it is because for me, the film has always read as a critique of European fascism, right? But also as a critique of the kind of institutional denazification of Germany after the Second World War. For those that don't know, following the Second World War, after the German defeat, it was occupied by the 4 different powers, and each in their own way sort of instituted these policies, these educational reforms, these whatevers of like denazification. What you did was bad. Don't do it again. And this has kind of been read as a bit of a success, especially for those of us who see Germany in the last like 30, 40 years as this kind of like sponsor of cultural whatever, of the arts. In Lebanon we have 5,000 fucking, NGOs and the Goethe Institute, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Heinrich Böll. There are so many, Rosa Luxemburg. And they mostly work on, this like it's a soft power. It's also a place of refuge. It's a place that took in 1 million refugees in 2016. Whatever. It's sort of like had this image of moving beyond its Nazi past. But in the last 6-7 months, it's become very, very clear that there's a lot of those tendencies that are like resurfacing. And so the initial thing that I've been thinking a lot about is I've been seeing a lot of people describe fascism, authoritarianism, this type of police brutality, or even just the bullshit liberal rhetoric that's coming out of their press. It's not liberal, it's fascist, but from what used to be known as the liberal press, essentially going tooth and nail and fighting for this genocide and defending Israel. And so a lot of people criticizing these policies, these attitudes, describe it as a rot, as a defect, as a sort of malpractice. And I think that's completely missing the point. I see so many of these things, fascism in itself, or taking it a few steps behind, nationalism and this sort of intense patriarchy and patriarchal violence, and obviously capitalism and imperialism. These things formed over hundreds of years in Europe, right? And it's not something that just came from outside in 1930. It's something that developed and built upon itself and reproduced itself. And in many ways, the fascism of Europe in the 30s was very much so replications of what was happening in the colonies for decades, just brought home, brought into Europe. And Edward Said knew this, he says that the ways that European anti-Semites talked about the Jews is very similar to Orientalism, the way they're othered, they're exoticized, the way they're described as both impotent and all-powerful, the way that they're kind of held in suspicion and ultimately othered in a way that enables the dehumanization that then can lead to their extermination in the exact same ways that we're seeing is being done to Palestinians and to Arabs and Muslims. And so why I bang on about this point is because in thinking of A Clockwork Orange, in thinking of the orange, the organic, right? It is not a rot. Alex's violence is not something that comes from the outside that needs to be surgically removed. It is something that is built in. And so how to remove it is much more complicated, how to fix it, how to create whatever. And even the kind of fix they come up with the film, to use these methods of a fascist ideal of just surgically removing it, doesn't work. But regardless, it sort of misses the point as well. And so I've been thinking a lot about this white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist, patriarchal violence as an organic development, as the project of Europe, right? If you want to understand what Europe looks like, look at its prisons, look at its police, look at its colonies, look at who it deals with, who it's giving billions of dollars to Sisi, to the Israelis, to all the authoritarian states. In thinking of it as the organic, it helps understand that it connects it with its longer history. I find myself a lot of the times, now in Vienna, now in the imperial center. Austria isn't necessarily, one of the strongest imperial powers, but for hundreds of years it was the center of Europe, right? And when you take a tram through the city, you see it. And I start really wondering, where do all these bricks come from? Where does all this metal come from? Where does all this wealth? You go to its museums and you're like, where the fuck did they get why is Montezuma's headdress here in Vienna, right? Where do they get these collections and all this money? Europe, as a construction of hundreds of years, is built off of the global south. We know this. This is a very basic analysis, And so why am I thinking so much about this now? Because there is a huge mobilization globally against Zionism, and so much of the Western world is fighting so intensely against that mobilization. And again, you have to ask yourself why. And I think a lot of people are very confused. I think there's so much about Zionism, there's so much about the state of Israel, that reveals so much about the Western world. Zionism is a project of settler colonialism. Where does settler colonialism come from? Where does the idea of creating a national home, a state, a nation state, where does that come from? These are European ideas, right? Israel is currently committing genocide against the indigenous population. Where have we seen that before, if not through the European conquest of the Americas, of Australia, or in so many colonial settings, in South Asia, in Africa, in the Congo? It's These are forms of European oppression and violence. And what Israel is doing is really exposing itself, right? It's exposing its brutality, its monstrosity, and in a sense, exposing the reality that is European legacy, right? Not just of European anti Semitism, like why does the state of Israel exist to begin with, but also in the forms it's taking, in the violence and the oppression and whatever. And so I think it really connects to this organic growth that creates the state of Germany and also creates the state of Israel, that creates the United States and the violence that comes with it, that it's a state built on genocide. There is like an immediate connection to a criticism of the state of Israel from an anti-colonial perspective, from a perspective of not just anti-Netanyahu, but anti-Zionist in terms of no to the creation and the continuation of this oppressive ethno-state, right? I mean, even look at the borders. I think Hungary and the United States, they buy border technology from Israel. Like, Israel really, so much of what it's doing and has done for years really implicates so many of these states. But I think essentially what we're seeing now in Europe, and every single day we wake up and we see new scenes. I mean, my God, the last couple of weeks, how the United States, how these police departments have been brutalizing these students, how the entire political class cannot see anything but agitators or anti-Semites and just are completely dislodged from reality, is because I think they are so consumed with this ideology of Zionism, but also of white supremacy. And so I think what I'm connecting here is that the process of denazification as we know it, is very similar to that Ludovico method of Alex, right? Of the futile but also fascistic attempt at just removing this one piece of the whole. And here we're talking about using fascist solutions to fascist problems. And the idea of surgically removing a piece of behavior, to me, really reads like the same logic as removing one people, one group, and that'll fix it. But obviously, A, it doesn't, and B, it's super fucking immoral and fucked up. And it makes me really reflect on this very famous quote by Audre Lorde of, "We cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools." And so, in thinking of denazification or of decolonialism as a whole, we really have to reckon with what tools do we have and what tools work and don't, and, all that. But also I think, like I said earlier on, this connects to the wider history. And by saying that, I mean not Germany losing its mind and becoming whatever, but really returning to form, right? And the brutality, the propaganda, the lies, how they genuinely seem blind to what they're doing. Again, I think there's so much of the authoritarian shifts happening in Europe and in the United States that is so familiar to any Arab, to most of us in the global South. There's so much of this illusion of international law, of this law-based order or whatever, that they care about human rights, that is just completely dissolving. And, a lot of it was just premised on because there was a sort of stability, and a stability premised on so much continued injustice. And I think what they're really scared of is, Palestinian demands for liberation do not fit within this kind of liberal understanding of just, hey, please give us our rights, that there is so much active armed resistance because so much of those other methods have just completely been crushed. And so I think, they're threatened, but they're also threatened by these protests, by signs of solidarity, by whatever, because it implicates them. Because what I think, really powerful demands, feminist demands, anti-capitalist demands, indigenous demands, require these power structures to give up some of their power, you know? And I think that's so much of what we're seeing, the violence and rejecting that. But I don't know, it's a really scary analysis, honestly, and it's one that I hesitate to make. Because what I'm saying is that a lot of the violence we're seeing, if you look at German police officers beating up protesters, like, first of all, I see these as little examples of Alex Duvall, whatever the kid's name is in A Clockwork Orange. Like, if you're white, if you're straight, if you want to beat up brown and black people, join the police, you know? And their violence is so legitimized because it is structured within this kind of white supremacist authoritarian state that's becoming increasingly empowered, and there's not really much resistance to it. But also, one huge conclusion that I have to reach is that we do have a long road ahead of us, that the road of anti-imperialism, of anti-capitalism, anti-Zionism, anti-colonialism, all these things are interconnected. A lot of us that are marred within intersectional feminism have known this for a very long time, but it's becoming increasingly clear now. And there's not going to be these quick fixes. There's not going to be any of these things that are just like slowly removed because they're not outside things. They're not misunderstandings, you know? The amount of brutality that people have been facing is not a mistake. The German state is not going to wake up tomorrow and be like, oh my God, wait, you're right, this is a genocide. How did we not see it? They are so in the shit that they can't see outside of it. What we are seeing is not a mutation of Europe, but a return to form. This is not the only, but this is an organic formation of Europe. White supremacist, authoritarian nationalism, these are European traditions. This is something that has developed for hundreds of years, and they've not gone away, right? They've taken different forms, but now it's really returning to a brute, naked power. And how to dismantle that, how to resist it, sometimes even how to fucking survive under it, are questions that many of us are asking, and will be questions that are becoming more and more urgent to answer as they go deeper into it, and they push themselves further and further into these corners, but also as the collapses compound. Here I've only spoken that much about Palestine, but obviously there are so many other struggles that are, problems for Europe. I mean, for fuck's sake, if you really want to understand Europe and what Europe is, not what it is from a certain perspective, but what is it? Go to its borders. Look at who they're paying. They've just given $1 billion to the Lebanese state. For why? So that it can be another one of these states that prevents migration, right? They've just given Sisi billions of dollars for the exact same purpose. The Tunisian president, dictator, fascist, anti-black piece of shit. And they're pushing boats back. I mean, my God, just yesterday, the Home Office in the United Kingdom published a video congratulating itself about deporting Syrians and other refugees to Rwanda. Like, it's a horrific, horrific thing, and it's not just Rishi Sunak or whatever the fuck, right? This is part of the kind of core. This is part of the organic growth of Europe in all its ugliness, in all its brutality. And honestly, I'm terrified. I'm terrified of the conclusions of that analysis, because it means we have so much work to do. It means that we are dealing with incredibly intense, powerful players, and that our methods need to change. Because at the moment, most people in Europe, the most they can imagine is, protesting and demanding and whatever. But clearly, these are not, figures and structures that are willing to change because they don't have a fucking conscience. And because they're not listening, and because they cannot listen. And so many of the ideas that they will and must listen are really premised on liberal ideas that I think are destroying, and they're destroying themselves. And so, what is being described as Fortress Europe is not a right-wing project. It is a center project. It is a project that has been taking place and developing for a decade or so now, and has become just so normalized that no one gives a shit. I think if we take a little bit of a historic perspective, 2015 was just not that long ago. And the UK deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda is like so clearly a manifestation of this. And again, Israel fucking knows this. Israel talks about them being defenders of Western civilization, right? Which is code for the white race, It's not code, it's just the new term for it. They talk about, if it weren't for us, there would be floods of migrants to Europe, right? We are a bulwark. And it kind of reminds me of exactly what Theodor Herzl described in his pamphlet, The Zionist State, I think written in 1905, 43 years before the State of Israel is founded. But he clearly describes it, this will be a bulwark for Europe against the barbarians. Even though it is creating and perpetuates the existence of millions of Palestinian refugees, but in the last 8 months has created so many more refugees. But it is still framed and whatever, and it still shows itself as we are defending European interests. And the thing is again, I think as a final note, I'm returning constantly to this phrase of believe them, believe what they say, right? Not their propaganda, not their whatever. But when Herzog, or whatever, the president of the State of Israel, goes up and says, we are defending Western civilization, I think that's true. And I think that is a damning prognosis or diagnosis or whatever description of actually, that is what the West is. So much of this wealth, so much of this society, so much of what we understand of Europe is premised on the dispossession, of the theft, of the complete colonization of the world, right? Which includes massacres, which includes genocide. And so here again, Israel is not the rot of Western civilization. It exposes so much of the ugly, brutal, naked Europe in the worst manifestations of it. And it's really fucking scary that so many states are just completely going along and going even above and beyond. And it's a mark of hope that there are people who see through it in the global north, obviously so many people in the global south. The South African delegation who puts forward whatever, Nicaragua, fucking Colombia just the other day cutting ties completely. I don't have that much faith in these things, but I have more faith in the people who are mobilizing across the world. I think what we are witnessing is a massive collapse of this project. Ever since October 7, it's been challenged, and it is incredibly destructive. And I don't know what post-Zionism looks like. I also have to try to imagine what the post-US looks like, post-Europe looks like, because I think that's really difficult to do, obviously. Again, I hope this episode kind of made sense. I do think there's a basic structure to the analysis that I presented that's kind of clear, but I hope you found it helpful or at least interesting. And yeah, I'm happy to have shared that. It's something really weird happens when I get into things like this. I go into a zone and I completely forget that I'm recording or that I'm talking. I just so it's going to be interesting listening to this back, and I hope I am actually quite coherent, because that's the main thing I strive for. Anyway, this has been another episode of Politically Depressed. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you appreciate this podcast, consider becoming a member of our Patreon or leaving me a few bucks in the tip jar below. And I'll see you all next week.